Dotiv, Integrative and Preventive Healthcare. Hey guys, I'm Tasha.
Hey listeners, this is Guni, and we're here to discuss lifestyle medicine. What really strikes me these days is how mental health and depression has been at the forefront of health discussions, and actually a new wave. I don't know if new is the right word, but there's a lot of conversation around assisted therapy through psychedelics, specifically psilocybin, also known as magic mushrooms, which is basically a plant-based psychedelics. And psychedelic assisted therapy has been in clinical trials in countries such as Brazil, Canada, Israel, Spain, Switzerland, the UK, and also the US. Quite an exciting time to see where these new ways of approaching depression are turning up to be.
Billions, a TV show that I watch, where the lead character, Bobby Axelrod, he's the billionaire who's trying to tap into his subconscious mind to kind of access a higher version of himself so that, he can, become better. And so he connected with this Amazonian shaman who was conducting the ceremony, the ayahuasca ceremony. The psychedelic that I was introduced to was ayahuasca, which is a South American psychoactive brew, which is used both socially and as a ceremonial spiritual medicine amongst the indigenous people of the Amazon. It just made me think about how amazing this tool could also be on top of healing or helping you heal your depression, being an aspect of you to access parts of your mind to be a better version of yourself.
Yeah, definitely. And there's a lot of wisdom that can be brought by ancestors, right? Because these are the ayahuasca example is something that's been done for years now. And the thing is that in that setting, it looks a bit woo-woo, but what the clinical trials and research are doing is, given the right setting, how can this be of use?
Yeah, I think that the key word here is safe and also trusted environment, where, because people tend to misconstrue you're using psychedelics, you're just doing it for recreational purposes, and it's a fun trip that you're going on.
Right.
And so I guess it's important for us to kind of give context and nuance to the fact that there is a difference between recreational and therapeutic use. And for this, we have Haya Haji, and she is a positive psychologist from Saudi Arabia. She specializes in psychedelic integration, and her main interests include positive clinical psychology and bridging the gap between psychedelic science in the region, the Middle East and North African / Southwest Asia and North Africa region. Haya, thank you so much for being here. We are excited and intrigued to have this conversation. Hello and welcome.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited.
Welcome, Haya. Haya, as a starting point, we'd like to know, what are your observations between those who take psilocybin as part of assisted, therapy versus the ones who are taking it recreationally?
So what's the difference between the group of people that tend to take it recreationally and the group of people that tend to take it therapeutically? Is that the question?
Yes, I think that's that. And I guess it's the setting being so different.
Yeah, absolutely. So in a clinical setting, when someone takes psilocybin or when someone ingests psilocybin, they're doing it after having a number of preparatory sessions with a trained clinical psychologist or a trained mental health professional. Whereas in a recreational setting, there's none of that support. So in a clinical setting, if you were to, let's say you were to participate in a clinical trial for psilocybin assisted psychotherapy, you'd be working with a therapist, usually two therapists, and you'd be doing a number of preparatory sessions where your intention would be discussed, where your medical and psychological history would be discussed, where the treatment would be tailored to you. And then you would come to the dosing session in which you'd be dosed in a clinical setting that's supervised, that's controlled, and that's regulated. And you'd be doing so also with a therapist dyad, so two therapists, usually male and female. And after the experience, you'd also be working with these same therapists to integrate the downloads, let's say, or whatever comes up during the experience itself. In this setting, in a clinical or medical setting, you have a lot of support and a lot of supervision and a lot of guidance. The dose you're getting is measured too. So you know what kind of psilocybin you're getting. It's usually pharmaceutical grade psilocybin, not magic mushrooms. In a recreational setting, as previously mentioned, none of that psychological support. It's really hard to dose the substance. Usually people consume magic mushrooms or psilocybin mushrooms as opposed to psilocybin itself, like for the pharmaceutical version of it, which means that the experience could really vary, because when you consume psilocybin mushrooms as opposed to consuming psilocybin pharmaceutical grade, like the isolated compound of psilocybin, there can be a compound effect from the other molecules that exist within the mushroom. And every mushroom, there's so many different types of mushrooms, so every species has its own chemical makeup, and that could really affect the experience too. But the main thing that I would really say is the difference is this idea of the set and setting, set being mindset and setting being the environment. These are two factors that greatly influence the psychedelic experience. And when one is doing, when one is having an experience in a controlled, supervised, regulated setting, their mindset is more intentional, and it's more supported by the psychologists or the therapists in the room. And the setting is very much curated for therapeutic purposes. Right. Whereas when someone does it in a recreational setting, you could do it in a recreational setting and have the intention to heal or the intention to let go, or you could really tailor your intention in a responsible and mindful way. However, the variables or the unpredictability is a lot higher. Mm-hmm. So it's a lot riskier. Same thing with setting. Like if someone were to be doing mushrooms at a party, you don't really have control over the environment. So things could go either way.
I think the key word is really how unpredictable your setting is, and the key difference between those two, right? And how, even though you could have the same intention, it's like, what is your environment? And your environment can actually have a very big impact on the actual experience, even though you set the intention.
Absolutely.
And what has been your experience as a psychologist, and how do you see this movement, and how does it resonate to you?
So the way that I've seen the field progress is very interesting. It was very slow at first. There was a lot of stigma. There was a lot of misinformation around it. And then suddenly there was a book that was published in 2018 called How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan. And this book really introduced psychedelics to the mainstream. Prior to that, it was a bit more fringe or a bit more niche. And with the introduction of this book, or with the publication of this book, it really hit the mainstream, because the book was written in a way that's accessible to the everyday person who's never heard of psychedelics, from the suburban mom to the Wall Street professional.
Right.
So it's exploded in the last few years. I wrote my senior thesis on the clinical uses of psychedelics in 2017, and I only had a handful of studies and articles to work with, and I had a substantial amount of articles and studies. I mean, enough for me to write a thesis about it. But after that year in 2018, it was like every week there was an article on psychedelics. Every so often there was a study that was being published. So it's been interesting. There's a lot of nuances though with the progress of the field. So I think now that it's become a bit more mainstream, or now that it's become more mainstream, there's a lot more questionable characters that are entering the field. So
yeah, and I guess like maybe in the context of our conversation, since you've seen how you've seen it progress over time, in particular like psilocybin, for example, because it's associated with like much people. Is synonymous with magic mushrooms. What actually psilocybin is, and what does it do to us?
So psilocybin is the active molecule in magic mushrooms. So it's the psychoactive compound, and what it does is there are many ways in which it affects a person, but and it depends on the dose. Dose is very much it's very much contingent on the dose that one consumes. But in lower doses, it can have some elevate mood. It can boost energy and creativity. It can help with presence. This is microdosing, but microdosing is still, there's a big question mark. Is it placebo, or is there an actual effect? But regardless of whether or not it's placebo or there's an actual effect, people are reporting that they are benefiting from lower doses of psilocybin. What I spoke about now is more microdoses, so low doses. And then medium doses, one can begin to experience like an alteration in consciousness. One might become a lot more connected with the energetic world or the energetic field around them in a way that is not accessible to them in waking consciousness or in sober consciousness. So, for example, colors might become a lot more vibrant and alive, and the way that one thinks might become a bit unusual. So what it does in higher doses is that it creates connections between parts of the brain that usually do not communicate with one another. So, and you might experience synesthesia, which is sensing senses with different senses, if that makes sense. So like being able to hear colors or taste sound, things of that sort. And you might relive old memories. You might be able to process traumas by being able to relive these old memories, of course, contingent on the fact that you're doing it in a safe environment.
Right. So like preparatory sessions actually mean psychotherapy?
It could be psychotherapy. It could also be coaching.
Okay.
I guess it's also for the person to know exactly what's coming their way, right? Like making them understand what are the different potential stages, or what to kind of be aware of, what could happen, not happen, and it's preparing the person for the worst as well, I think, so that you're managing expectation. Would that be a good description of the pre-meeting?
So there's an element of what you described, which is psychoeducation, but there's also an element of getting to know the person and their needs a bit more and understanding their intention. It's really, the preparatory sessions very much focused on intention, equipping the individual with the skills to be able to navigate the experience, and of course explaining that it's not all rainbows and butterflies. In a sense, like there might be one might experience bliss and awe and ego disillusion in a positive way, but there's also a chance that difficult experiences might come up. So there's this there's an introduction of this idea of like equanimity, which is one's ability to notice and observe sensations and emotions without necessarily ascribing a positive or negative valence to it. So neutrality, in a sense.
Right. Could be interesting to go through what setting an intention mean, because it might be a bit too abstract for some people. Could you walk us through what an intention would look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So depending on what's going on in an individual's life and what's drawing them to psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, the intention would be brought out. So if someone is drawn to psilocybin assisted psychotherapy because they've suffered with depression their whole life, then their intention can be to unpack their depression or to alleviate the symptoms of their depression. Or if someone has dealt with a specific childhood trauma, let's say, the intention might be to further explore that experience and to readjust their narrative around that experience, in a sense. Or if someone has tried many different methods of quitting smoking. So let's say someone has a nicotine or a tobacco addiction and they want to break that, and they've tried multiple different therapies or treatments and nothing has worked. So they would come to sessions with the intention of addressing their tobacco or nicotine addiction. Does that clarify?
Yeah, I think, being specific about the outcome and what is it exactly that you are trying to unpack or explore.
I would not say being specific about the outcome, because there's not much control over that. I would say being specific about the reason why.
Of the why.
Yeah, exactly. So the set, what is it that you're trying to, what kind of mindset are you trying to bring into this experience?
So we kind of touched on the positive sides of how psilocybin could affect you. So when you administer, or not you particularly, but if someone administers psilocybin, what are the potential risks and what could be, a negative outcome?
Yeah, so there are many risks associated with psychedelics or with psilocybin. Physiologically, the substance has a very safe profile, meaning that one will not overdose or have a adverse physical reaction to psilocybin. However, psychologically, there are some risks associated with the substance. The risks being it can be very disorienting. So if one doesn't have the proper support, they can really get lost in this landscape, this unusual or non-ordinary landscape. And it can be disorienting. Sometimes things might come up, like let's say someone might re-experience memories that are frightening. And if they're not supported, then they might not be able to make sense of it. And this can be deeply disturbing, and this can affect one afterwards. So it can, not very often, but it is possible that someone might be traumatized by the experience. There's some, in more severe cases, people might experience depersonalization or extended prolonged dissociation. And there are very, very rare instances in which people may experience psychosis, so substance-induced psychosis. Addiction is not a risk.
Yeah, so would you mind explaining the dissociation bit?
So dissociation is when one becomes out of touch with their body and their reality.
Would it be fair to say it's like they're like in a limbo?
Yes, they're not grounded.
Right.
They're not in touch with their reality, in a sense, and with their surroundings. It's like being checked out from your body, in a sense.
Right. Is that the same thing as what you said as depersonalization?
Depersonalization is when you lose touch with yourself. There are similarities and there are differences. So dissociation is more like being kind of absent from your physical body and your reality. So depersonalization is like losing touch with your identity, or losing touch with your ego structure in a way that is unhelpful, because it doesn't allow you to function as a part of society, and to be able to interact with your surroundings as you.
It is helpful to be in a ego loss, basically, to unravel some of your trauma. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So as part of the psychedelic experience, or in therapy, one of the mechanism of action by which psilocybin assisted psychotherapy works is that it leads to ego death or ego dissolution, which can be very helpful as long as you have a professional or you have the resources to put your ego back together so that you can rejoin reality. So, I mean, our ego is important for us to be able to function as human beings, as human beings that are in relation to others. So being able to unravel the ego so that you can strip yourself from your cultural and societal conditioning, and to rearrange parts of your life that might not be working for you anymore, that's important, as long as you can come back to you, or come back to some form of you. But if you go into a psychedelic state and your ego is completely unraveled, but you stay there in that unraveled state, then you can't really rejoin reality, in a sense. You become out of touch. Yeah. You can't really function as a human being, which is when it becomes an issue.
So when you do experience an altered state of consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
I guess that when you are in that session, it's quite beautiful and powerful when you actually can strip down all the societal pressure, barriers, your learned behaviors, and it has no emotion. Actually, it's just there, it's facts, and it's very powerful to witness this. But it's true that the real world doesn't function like that. And you explaining that you need to reconstruct it so that you can rejoin reality. I think for people to understand that this is a very important step, I think will encourage them to be assisted properly for those ones who are doing recreationally without assistance.
Yeah, a key term there is what you were describing is integration. So that experience that you described could be very beautiful and very therapeutic, but how do you take it and make sense of it? How do you take it and how do you apply these learnings to your day-to-day lived experience or your day-to-day reality? And unfortunately, it's not easy to just check out and become a monk and move to a mountain, as tempting as that sounds. We have to rejoin reality, and we have to rejoin. We have to find a way to be able to navigate the world that we live in.
Yeah, psilocybin is the tool to unravel things, but then it's in your power to be able to make sense out of it and function in society.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think that people tend to use or like rely on psychedelics, or I guess any sort of substance, to as a form of like escapism, right? To think that this is going to either detach me from my problems, or as you said, disassociate in a lot of ways. So there is a very tricky line, and I guess that's where the clinical psychologist role comes in, because you're and coaching, right? The setting the clear intention. Otherwise, you can the intention can get lost in translation. I would think.
Absolutely. So when you describe like a person that's a bit far out, have you heard that term, when someone is like a bit too far out? So I mean, objectively speaking, maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like I'm talking about in relationship to people who might use psychedelics, overuse it for escapist purposes. When someone is far out, that means that you can't really reach them, you can't really connect with them or communicate with them, and that's very detrimental to their health and to the health of society, because I mean, we are animals that are in relation to others and in relation to our environment. So if one takes too much psychedelics because they're trying to escape, or they're trying to speed up this surpass, or like try to speed up the process of enlightenment, let's say, they're going to become really lost in these different realms, let's say, and they won't be able to make connections that will allow them to function as healthy human beings. So yeah, being too far out isn't a good thing.
Yeah, so kind of picking up on the point you were saying, where you can't, mushrooms are, or psilocybin is known not to be addictive, but I think that what is addictive, or what is, exciting, it's a shortcut to consciousness. It's a shortcut being in the now and the present, and sometimes ego death. That shortcut can be addictive, or so attractive that you would want to, tap into it. But then I think what happens is that you lose yourself in the process, because you don't know how to ground after going into these other realms.
Absolutely. That's very, very beautifully put, Buni. And that makes me think about a quote by Carl Jung, who he died before the late 60s, early 70s, and this whole wave of like psychedelic experimentation. I urge anyone who is listening to this to really contemplate this quote. Carl Jung says, "Beware of unearned wisdom." So that could be in the case of like when over consuming psychedelics, trying to become wiser, trying to reach enlightenment. It's not really what comes to you during the psychedelic experience or during psychedelic therapy. It's what you do afterwards. Downloads and making sense of it and incorporating into your day-to-day life, because otherwise it's just, if you're not making sense of what comes up during the experience, it's just another drug experience.
I call it the homework.
That's a really good point, and I think it gives another layer of like nuance to the fact that it's between recreational and clinical, right? So if you don't actually integrate the information that you download, it's just a fun experience.
Yeah.
Just for people who don't really know what to expect. And you kind of touched on this, but are there general phases that kind of people go through when they take psilocybin that they have to meet in the process, so that they know that it's a complete process?
I've traveled to the Netherlands on numerous occasions, and I've actually done work with a psychedelic retreat center over there. So I've had my own legal psilocybin experience, and the way I can run you through it. So basically what happens is, when you first ingest the substance, you have a period where you're coming up, or where the substance it's taking its effect. And that can be very confusing and very disorienting. So, you start realizing that like your body just feels very different. It doesn't feel the way it usually feels. You might have thoughts that are unusual too. It can be pleasant, it can be very confusing. So that's what we call like let's say like this is when you're ascending, or when you're coming up. And then there is the peak, or the height of it, in which there's many ways that one can experience this. On the positive end of it, there's this experience of awe, or this experience of ego dissolution, as we mentioned earlier, or an experience of this heart-opening experience, which is where the healing comes from. And then, that kind of comes and goes in waves that lasts about an hour or two, and then one starts to descend, in a sense, where the medicine or the substance starts to wear off. Did I explain that okay? Or
yeah, I think you hit the key pointers, I guess, that people should be aware of if they decide that they want to go and experience it.
During the ascension or the come up, let's say, one can really, because it's so disorienting, one can really experience resistance, and the resistance can cause a lot of pain or a lot of suffering, and emotions can come up that are uncomfortable, or emotions that have been buried down. But once someone surrenders to that experience, and that's what preparation really helps with one to be able to do, which is to surrender to the experience, then that's when things start to flow, and that's when one starts to really be able to dive into their subconscious mind and to go with the experience, to experience ego dissolution or ego death, and all the other beautiful healing aspects of the psychedelic journey.
Explain a bit more what you meant by the barrier or the restrictions. What is in the ascending phase? What is it exactly that, where does it come from? Is it like fear of what you're actually experiencing? So you're starting this journey or this experience, and you're saying there are restrictions that might come up. And where does this come from? Because we're seeing at the peak, you have potentially an ego death experience where all these, you're kind of dissociated with all these emotions.
Positively dissociated, yeah.
So what are these barriers? Where do they come from?
So the experience is very subjective. I wouldn't be able to speak on behalf of everyone, but from my own experiences in the Netherlands, with synthesis, where I worked, for me, what the resistance came from was, like, I guess, uncomfortable emotions that I had been suppressing. So it's really subjective, and it varies from person to person. But the reason why psilocybin assisted psychotherapy can be so helpful is because in our waking consciousness, we have these very intricately developed psychological defense mechanisms that can be very harmful in the long term. So we suppress emotions and memories that are difficult and that are painful so that we can function, in a sense. But what you resist persists. So what happens in a psychedelic experience or during the come up, let's say, is that these emotions will start to surface. So primarily emotions that typically are buried and start to surface might be something like anger, which beneath it really is sadness or grief. And you can imagine if you've spent so much time really pushing that stuff down and it starts to come up, it might be really confusing. It might be really comfortable to have to sit with these emotions, but there's no way to process it other than getting through it, to go through it. So and once you are able to actually allow these emotions to come up to the surface, acknowledge them, really feel them, embody them, feel them in your body, they pass through. And that's where you reach, that's when you can actually be ushered into a peak experience, a mystical experience, this experience of ego dissolution or ego death, which is very beautiful, very healing. I would like to just highlight one thing, actually, just to explain why it's so difficult to talk about the experience. It's because it's ineffable. It's described as being ineffable, meaning that there's no words that could do it justice in describing what the experience is like. It's something that is felt and not described.
What do you feel about journaling? Because a lot of people after they're doing this or during the experience start journaling.
But I would say that journaling is a great complementary practice to the psychedelic experience, meaning that it can be great in trying to make sense using words of the experience. It's a great tool to jot down what are the main takeaways in language form. it can be a great way of supporting the integration process. So putting down the key downloads, let's say, or the key insights or realizations. We're going to have to find a way to translate that into words, right? And if not, then there are other activities that one can engage in to embody the experience or the learnings of the experience. Active meditations like drumming, yoga, anything active, making music, because that doesn't use language, but that does help translate emotions.
Even though we're talking about psilocybin or assisted therapy and psychedelics assisted therapy, it's still kind of in research. It's still clinically trialed. Is it legal? Is it legal in the UK?
Psilocybin?
Yeah.
No, it's not legal in the UK yet. It will be very soon, in the next 5 years, we're hoping.
So where is it legal?
There's initiatives. It's legal in Jamaica. It's legal in the Netherlands. It's decriminalized in Portugal, but it's not legal in Portugal. It's decriminalized in parts of the US, such as Colorado.
So what's the difference between decriminalized and legal?
Yeah. What's the difference between legal versus decriminalized? So legal means that you can actually consume the substance without breaking a law, or you can purchase it without breaking a law. Whereas decriminalized means that it's like the least important thing in the eyes of law enforcement. So meaning that law enforcement don't see it as that big of a legal issue. However, if you are caught selling it, then you're going to be persecuted for that, or you're going to be arrested for it.
And so I guess we could probably speak for hours and keep going, but I think we should close off. So thank you, Haya. Before we close off, we normally do a rapid fire round of questions, and so just to get to know our practitioners and speakers. So the first question for you is, what is the first sign that you notice when you are out of balance?
Out of balance, I think gut issues.
All right. And our second question is, what is your method for coping when you notice that the gut is out of balance? What do you do?
I drink water.
Hydrate.
Hydrate,
Okay, yes. Simple and effective. And finally, what is one book or documentary or movie that has impacted your approach to well-being or wellness?
There's an excellent book called A Dose of Hope, which I recommend to everyone who's interested in the field of psychedelic therapy.
Who's the author?
It's by Dan Engel.
Okay.
I'm happy to send you a link to it.
Great.
The reason why it was very helpful is because it introduces very, very simplified tools that for the psychedelic experience, but not just for the psychedelic experience. I think like reality can be very psychedelic, so these tools can be used for day-to-day life.
Well, thank you, Haya, for your insight and giving us context to what psilocybin is and how we should approach it if we were considering it, and thank you for being on our show.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Haya.
If you enjoyed this episode, go ahead and select that follow or subscribe button. Till then, stay well.